Edition of Joe's Financial Fundamentals. Today I'm going to share with you some of the specifics of my own financial journey, broken down into 4 decades: my 20s, 30s, 40s, and now 50s. So, my investing roadmap and some lessons learned. As an aside, being that I'm currently in my late 50s, my next video will cover my game plan for my next decade, the 60s. So, my usual disclaimer that this information is intended only to provide general financial education for informational purposes only and should not be regarded as objective facts. This content does not provide financial, tax, legal, or any professional advice, and personal decisions should not be implemented based on this content. Do not act upon any information without first consulting a licensed investment, tax, or legal professional. So, entire books have been written about how to invest, how to build a portfolio, how to build wealth, and I won't try to compete with them in the next 10 minutes or so, but rather just give you an overview of my opinions based on my experience and what I have gleaned over the years. So obviously, most people starting their first job out of college are not in the greatest financial position. The most important thing is to just get started with such things as establishing an emergency fund, paying down debt, starting to contribute to a 401k, and beginning to save for a large purchase like perhaps a down payment for a house. Now, most of those things really have nothing to do with the stock market. Now, your 401k would be the exception. I'd recommend you go into some sort of index fund depending on what they offer. But other than that, and even if you're saving for a large purchase, say in the next 1 to 3 years, I wouldn't recommend putting that money in the stock market. It's certainly high risk, high reward, and you have the potential of losing some or all of it, and that's happened to me. I didn't, right, not in my 20s, but later on, I did buy a stock around the 2008 time frame, one of the automotive stocks that you may remember, declaring bankruptcy. So the stock price when I bought it was $10 a share and went to zero. Now, once you are in a little bit, better financial position to start investing, start thinking about your long-term goals, saving for retirement, college, etc., and how much risk you're willing to take to get that reward. For younger people, say if you're under 40 in the accumulation phase of wealth building, this typically means more risk. For retirees, say if you're greater than 60 starting to withdraw savings, this would typically mean less risk. It doesn't mean no risk because hopefully in your 60s you still have a fairly long time horizon of 20 plus years. Obviously between say 40 and 60 you're kind of in that middle ground, middle age, where you're still accumulating wealth, but you're also trying to position yourself perhaps for retirement. And that's kind of the path that I am currently on. So in my 20s, I've already shared in previous videos some of the stories about how I got started. But after making my student loan and car loan payments, I enrolled in my company's 401k for a relatively small amount by today's standards. I believe it was 3%, which equated to well under $1,000 a year. But it met the company match and I was getting, free money from them. So it felt good to get started. The other things I kind of focused on in my 20s, paying off student loans, car loans, saving for a down payment and purchasing a house, starting a college savings plan, and I started investing with Vanguard. I've talked about that, how I got started with Vanguard in previous video. And initially it was just small one-time contributions when I could. So really $25 here, $50 there, and back then you mailed it in an envelope, mailed a check, and they got it and put it in your account. So during my 20s, most of the assets were in my company's 401k. In my 30s, somewhere along the line, when the amount we spent each month kind of leveled off, one of the most important things I remember doing is taking my annual raises and any bonuses and distributing those amounts over several different things, such as increasing the 401k percentage, opening IRAs for my wife and I, starting to pay down mortgage principal, initiating an education IRA and later 3 529 plans, and finally setting up a monthly investment plan into my Vanguard taxable account with whatever was left over. So that's something they went into my kind of direct deposit. In the other direction, though, they took out, whatever $100 per month or whatever I could afford at that time, and put it into a Vanguard taxable account. The other thing that happened during my 30s is I did change employers. So I did roll over the 401k from a previous employer into what's called a rollover IRA with Vanguard. And that was what's called a tax-free distribution. And what I liked about that, I didn't have a lot of options at my previous employer's 401k as to what I could invest in. So being that it was now in an IRA, it was totally under my control and could invest it whenever I wanted. Now, as I mentioned here in the third or fourth bullet point, I talked about we did start making additional principal payments on our mortgage. In our 30s, we actually moved 3 times, and we're able to take the equity from each house and make larger down payments on subsequent houses. So, just as an example, let's say we were in a house that cost $200,000, and by the time we moved, let's say the mortgage loan balance was down to, let's say, 140, and let's say we sold it for, one of the houses we did make money on, so I'd say we sold it for 300, less the 140 we owed, and less any closing costs and all that. So let's say we took roughly $150,000, and you can roll that right into as a down payment into the next house. So we did that several times, and we didn't always make money on selling our houses. The first 2 homes we bought and sold, we did not make money. But anyway, we always took the equity that we had built in our house and rolled it into the next house. And the reason we were moving, by the way, I covered this in a previous video, is just work related. So during my 30s, most investment assets were still in the retirement accounts, but also this home equity was building. The 40s was really more of the same, maybe except of a little less emphasis on college savings, on accumulating college savings as the first of our kids started college. So now you start to withdraw from college savings plan investments. But we continued to increase 401k percentages, and I changed jobs again in my 40s, so it did another rollover. So again, I always had one account at Vanguard. It would go right to that same account in that case. Continued regular contributions to IRAs, and we converted, or I should say started with Roth IRAs at this time. Again, we continued moving again for work and did the equity thing, which worked out well, and continued building the taxable accounts, mostly in mutual funds. And here the big thing was starting to contribute to a health savings account, which is also called an HSA. So I started tracking net worth in my 40s, still mostly in retirement accounts, but college savings and home equity were right there. And the taxable accounts were starting to build. Now in my 50s, really been maintaining, when I was working in the corporate world, the 401k stuff, did another rollover, started a small business, opened a simple IRA, which functions similarly to a 401k. Kids are out of college now, so I've started to spend more time thinking strategically about retirement. and made some specific moves in my portfolio, which I'll talk about here in a minute, to lessen the exposure to the US stock market and put more emphasis on generating income in the form of dividends and bonds. Big thing here in our 50s was moved again, paid off the mortgage, so that's done with now. Accelerated HSA contributions, so now using the HSA as an investment tool to hopefully pay for a good share of healthcare expenses in retirement. I do not have long-term care insurance, and I covered the benefits of an HSA in a previous video, how it's triple tax-free. But then also made this portfolio shift, this mix shift, where I was very high in equities, probably 90% plus percent in stock mutual funds. We've brought that down to close to 75. So most people would say that's still pretty aggressive. It feels comfortable for me, even though it's still high equity. Some of these are more now dividend stocks, for example, that are a little safer. But anything in the stock market is subject to change for sure. So now, as I said, the mix is, my target mix is 75% 25 stocks, 25% bonds and cash, not including the home value. Slightly above that now, but like I said, in the last 5 years, I've made a concerted effort to reduce stock exposure, increase bond exposure to reduce volatility, and reduce the equity exposure and increase income. I also added an international index fund, even though international stocks have lagged the US for 10 plus years. So it's again along the idea of diversification. Added a high dividend yield fund to increase income and add diversification away from a fund I had previously, which was in large company growth stocks, mostly healthcare and technology. It was a great fund, but I just felt I wanted to reduce my risk a little bit. So some of the mutual funds I've invested over the years, and I've bolded current holdings that I have, these are all with Vanguard. The Star Fund, which is a great fund that I liked, had for many, many years, a balanced fund, which generally means a 60-40 split between stocks and bonds. And this is what's called a fund of funds. So the Star Fund invests in other mutual funds, Vanguard mutual funds. At the end of the day, it's a 60-40 split. But it's kind of interesting that this fund invests in other funds. It's an actively managed mutual fund versus the S&P 500 index, for example, which is a passive. And I talked in pretty good depth about the difference between active and passive mutual funds in a previous video. Total Stock Market Index, another good passive fund. Wellesley Income is the fund I went to, which gives you a little more income, again, a little bit more of a bond emphasis there. High Dividend Yield Index, the international index that I mentioned earlier. I had the Prime Cap fund for many years. It's a great fund. Just got to the point where I felt it was a little too aggressive for me and kind of sector-oriented, investing about 60% of their assets in tech and healthcare. Target retirement funds, that's what we kind of most prevalent in 401ks. I'm not in those anymore, but I did for many years. So in summary, paying down debt and saving early and often has worked out well for me. There certainly were mistakes along the way. But as has learning from my mistakes and building a diversified and balanced portfolio, which are part of my 3 guiding principles that I outlined in my very first video. So having a saver mentality, building diversification and balance, and learning from my mistakes. So now that I'm nearly 60, not yet, but nearly there, I'm focused on developing and starting to implement a retirement strategy over the next few years. And more about that in my next video. Thanks for watching. Please sub up. Give me a like if you're inclined to do so, and talk soon.